Part 1. Laying the Foundation. The 5 Market Influencers. Threat of Substitutes. At first glance, you may be wondering what the difference is between the threat of new entrants and the threat of substitutes. After all, if a new competitor enters the market, then of course there is a risk that the client may substitute your services with theirs, right? This is why it is important to draw a clear line between the threat of new entrants, the threat of substitutes, and standard industry rivalry. Here, the term substitutes is being used to describe products or services that exist outside of an industry's standard set of services or products, which can relatively easily be used to replace those services or products. When a new entrant comes into the industry, they could steal some of your business away from you, but they won't be taking any of that business outside of the industry as a whole. The delicious pie of the industry is still the same size, but your slice just got a little bit smaller. The same is true if one of your existing competitors takes business from you. However, when customers start to switch from your services to substitutes from outside the industry, it not only decreases your slice of the pie, but it also decreases the size of the whole pie. This drives down prices and margins for you and your competitors. Driving this threat of substitutes is a number of factors that should be taken into account when analyzing the industry, including, but certainly not limited to, the following: availability and number of substitutes, quality and nature of products and services, pricing of substitutes, costs associated with switching, difficulty or ease of substitution, and buyer behavior or willingness to substitute. Our market influencer evaluation will focus on 2 different types of substitutes: substitutes for translation and substitutes for core LSP functions. Translation is the ultimate service that is being provided through the language services value chain, but we need to keep in mind that the majority of players in this value chain are LSPs and don't actually provide translation. Instead, LSPs add value through the core functions of project management, vendor management, and sales. Only the translators actually add value through the act of translation, so they are at greatest risk of being replaced by substitutes for translation. If translation is replaced by a substitute service like machine translation, MT, for example, there is still an opportunity for an LSP to add value by managing the machine translation process, much like they previously managed the manual translation process. However, if their core functions are substituted, there is no opportunity for the LSP to retain their relevancy in the value chain. Workflow automation can replace project management. Crowdsourcing platforms can replace traditional vendor management. Availability and number of substitutes. The first factor affecting the threat of substitutes in the language services industry is the availability of substitutes. This provides us with the opportunity to take a closer look at some, if not all, of the more commonly discussed substitutes. Fortunately for us, and for you, who has to read through all of these, there are not many. Generally, if LSBs want to localize their products and services to better compete in the global marketplace, they must employ LSPs for the necessary adaptation, translation, interpretation, and other services. Companies either translate their content or they don't. It is tempting to say that do nothing is the biggest competitor to the LSP. Translation can be expensive, and some customers just aren't ready to open their wallets. We can't even begin to tell you how many times we have seen a potential customer decide not to buy language services simply because they chose instead to do nothing. However, doing nothing is not technically a true substitution because in order for it to be a true substitution, it would have to effectively achieve the same results of the original service. This is not to say, though, that there are 0 options for the price-sensitive LSB who wants to reach a global audience without forking over the big bucks. There are certainly ways to strategically cut some corners, and we discuss several of these in this section. In the previous section on the threat of new entrants, we focused on LSPs and CLPs because it is a threat that affects players on the vendor side of the value chain. For the following section on substitution, we focus our examples less on LSPs and more on LSBs, because the decision to use substitute services lies solely on the client side. Machine translation. Earlier in this book, we, begrudgingly, touched on language technology providers, or LTPs, and acknowledged that they play a very important role within the industry. One category of LTPs is machine translation providers, who develop complex software and artificial intelligence to translate content into multiple languages without any human interaction at all. Remember that in the first chapter we identified the language services industry as any and all business related to helping clients, language services buyers, adapt or create content, products, or services in order to better compete in the global marketplace. LTPs undisputably fit nicely into this definition. So, MT may not technically be a true substitute at the industry level. This having been said, MT providers represent a very small fraction of the industry as a whole, and a big chunk of the development in this area is happening on the client side because only obscenely large companies like Microsoft and Google have truckloads of money needed to perform research and development in machine translation. For these reasons, we will be looking at MT as a substitute service that threatens the larger localization services industry. We understand that those reading this book from the perspective of a language technology specialist may be frustrated to not be included. However, they can take pride in the fact that they are disrupting the foundations of the language services industry to the point where people like us are rewriting the book to account for it. The reality for LSPs and translators is that MT has not quite reached the point where it can be a full substitute for human-generated translation. MT has been around for a long time, and LSPs and translators are still making a lot of money. Perhaps the day will come when machines are able to replace human translators, but when that day comes, we will have larger problems to worry about as we huddle in our bunkers plotting our resistance against our robot overlords. For now, MT can be thought of as a productivity tool that can be used in specific situations to increase the output of traditional translation supply chains. Translators have adapted to this new technology by becoming expert MT consultants or offering machine translation post-editing, MTPE, services. Meanwhile, LSPs have adapted by simply adopting it into their project management toolkit and using it to add value. IKEASATION. For those of you that have been living in a cave for the last several decades, let us please take a moment to get you up to speed. If you are already aware, please feel free to skip the next few paragraphs. IKEA is a global home furnishing warehousing store. The first IKEA opened for business in 1957, and since then they expanded into other Scandinavian countries before moving on to Switzerland and Germany, then to the rest of Europe, and ultimately to the rest of the world. As of the time of this writing, IKEA operates in over 300 stores in over 41 countries worldwide. All of IKEA's products come unassembled, not because IKEA doesn't know how to assemble furniture, but rather because this is all part of the grand strategy. This allows IKEA to keep logistics costs low and also creates a whole new class of customers, the buyer without a truck. If you were to buy a new bed from a typical furniture store, you would need access to a truck or a moving van to bring it home, or you would need to pay extra for delivery. If you were to buy the same bed from IKEA, you could walk out of the store with a compact box full of components that could easily be tied to the top of your Skoda or even dragged into a public bus back to your apartment. Truly, they are one of the most sophisticated global players in the home furnishing industry, competing in local markets that used to be completely dominated by domestic companies. While there are many interesting cases to be taken from IKEA's globalization strategy, the one we are most interested in today is how they localize their documentation. Each of these unassembled pieces of particle board need to be constructed at home by the customer, which means each product comes with a set of instructions. Typically, installation, assembly, and maintenance instructions constitute about 90% of content that is localized by a company, which essentially means that it also represents about 90% of the company's cost for localization. That is a lot of expense. However, from the LSP's perspective, it is a lot of revenue. IKEA eliminates this cost completely by creating instruction manuals with only pictures and not a single word to translate. They have effectively substituted localization with cartoons. IKEA did not invent this strategy. It has been around for ages. Next time you are on an airplane, take a look at the passenger safety card in the seat back pocket. You will notice that there are no complicated instructions in multiple languages, only pictures. How many times have you ever accidentally gone into the wrong gender bathroom in a foreign country because you couldn't understand the signs on the doors? Never? Because this information is almost always conveyed through pictures, not writing. IKEASATION is a viable substitute for translation for any company looking to convey very important information in a way that is understood by anybody, regardless of language. Crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing has been very much in vogue in the language services industry for a number of years now. The idea that rather than pay high-priced translators to provide translations, companies could just let, quote-unquote, the crowd translate for free. Facebook is perhaps the most influential LSP that popularized this method. They had so many passionate users around the world that they could simply allow these users to provide their translations for free. This also meant that the translations were being provided by scores of amateur translators with very little quality control. Crowdsourcing is not a substitute for translation. After all, the whole concept of crowdsourcing is that there are quote-unquote real translators working on the content, even if they are unvetted amateurs. Essentially, crowdsourcing is a substitute service for the core function of vendor management, as it removes distance between content and translators. When one of the three core functions is essentially eliminated, LSPs are not able to add as much value and therefore lose their competitive advantage. Fortunately for LSPs, crowdsourcing seems to have decreased in popularity in recent years. After the excitement and hype wore off, people began to view crowdsourcing much like they view MT, a useful tool to increase productivity in a very specific situation, but perhaps not the industry disruptor that everybody thought or speculated it may be. Process automation. Process automation threatens to replace many aspects of the project management core function. When we talk about automation, we could easily be talking about a number of things. There are project management tools that increase productivity, therefore reducing the amount of project management services needed. There are also fully automated solutions that seek to cut project managers completely out of the workflow. We delve deeper into our discussion on project management automation in part 2 of this book. Here, we suffice it to say that the threat of process automation acting as a potential substitute is real, though not as worrisome as some may think. LSBs would like nothing better than to cut out the need for project management completely from the language services value chain. A fully automated process has long been the sought-after holy grail of the industry. For now, let's just say that process automation, much like machine translation and crowdsourcing, can be a very effective tool when used properly in specific situations. It is still, however, a long way off from completely eliminating the need for project management for most companies. Smart LSPs have embraced this trend towards automation. Technology support activities are established to enable project managers to add more value with fewer resources. This allows LSPs to stay relevant and competitive by providing even more value through their project management core function than they would be able to without the aid of automation. Quality and nature of product or service. Some products and services are easily interchangeable, others not. The human race's ability to so effectively communicate with each other is what separates us from the animals. There is nothing that can fully replace language. Nothing. Not even really well-drawn IKEA cartoons. Of course, some people who come back from a year abroad or from a weekend silent meditation retreat talk about how verbal and written language just serves to separate us and puts our minds into boxes, and that real communication is the language of the heart. Hogwash. If you don't speak English and you call 911 in an emergency, you are going to be very grateful when an interpreter comes on the line. What we are trying to say here is that language, by its very nature, does not have any fully effective substitutes readily available. We use language to build relationships, to learn more about the world around us, to convince others to agree with us, and for practically every other activity that makes humans, well, human. This is true for the language services industry more than almost any other industry in the world. Virtually any other product or service in the world can be replaced by a substitute. Perhaps not easily, but it can be done. Take away your iPhone and you will spend more time on your computer. Take away Renato's car and he'll substitute it by taking the bus. Take away Tucker's coffee and he'll substitute it with a sharp knife in your throat. All of these changes would suck horribly, but we would survive. However, if you take away language, we lose our relationships, our identities, and so much more of what makes us human. So it is safe to say that language itself is not in danger of being replaced by a substitute. However, this doesn't mean that other core functions cannot be substituted. Project management, vendor management, and sales can be automated to a certain extent, as we touched on above. So far, attempts to substitute any of these three core functions have proved to be less than fully effective. Years ago, MT was supposed to replace translators. It hasn't. Recently, crowdsourcing platforms were going to replace the need for vendor management. Last time we checked on this hasn't happened either. Companies that offer to automate and simplify the language services value chain are nothing more than an attempt to cut out the sales function and the value it adds by educating and consulting with their clients. As of today, nobody has been able to replace the unique value of human consulting in the industry. At the end of the day, the language services industry is still relationship-driven. Nobody has yet been able to find a suitable substitute for human relationships. Pricing of substitutes. If the pricing of substitute products or services in any given market is lower than that of the original products and services, the likelihood of customers shifting their attention to the substitute increases. If the pricing of substitutes is higher, then it decreases the risk of customer switching. The substitute would only be worth considering if there was a risk that the market prices may change to the point where the substitute's price may decrease. Think about how many biodiesel vehicles you see driving down the road. Not many, right? Biodiesel is technically a feasible substitute for regular diesel. However, biodiesel is currently about 150% more expensive than regular diesel. So, if you make your money selling regular diesel, you may acknowledge that biodiesel is a potential threat because if it drops in price, or if regular diesel increases in price, then you suddenly face a situation where your customers are going to switch over to biodiesel. This factor of pricing is by far the number one driver that increases the threat of substitutes in the localization industry. As we have discussed already, there are few, if any, good reasons other than price for an LSB to look for alternatives to language services, so the decision is almost always driven by price. The pricing of MT, for example, can be anywhere from practically free to thousands of dollars. This really depends on the level of sophistication you are looking for from your MT engines. There are a number of publicly available MT options that you could technically start using immediately, but you may not get very good results. If you have some budget to spend, then you would develop or license customized MT engines that could be specifically trained with your brand-specific content so as to get better results. Generally speaking, though, even when an LSB partners with an MT provider to license customized engines, the greatest costs are incurred up front. After the initial setup, the monthly subscription and maintenance fees are nominal, much cheaper than paying for the content to be translated by an LSP. Typically, the return on investment for MT comes quickly and is quite profound. Substitute switching costs. Costs associated with switching are sometimes different than the overall price of substitutes. Above, we use the example of higher prices of biodiesel compared to traditional fuel deterring customers from making the switch. This works as an example when talking about pricing because typically there are no conversion costs to switch your vehicle from diesel to biodiesel. If you have a diesel engine, you can substitute biodiesel tomorrow without having to make any additional modifications to your vehicle. What would happen, though, if you wanted to convert your vehicle to run on natural gas? Generally, natural gas is much cheaper than biodiesel, so there is a clear cost advantage here. However, before you can substitute natural gas for diesel, you would first need to invest in making the proper modifications to your vehicle's engines. These modifications are costly and represent the costs associated with substitution. The same is true when it comes to substitutes for language services. As mentioned for MT, the overall price is heavy on the initial setup cost to develop and train the MT engines. Other initial costs could be restructuring or rewriting your content to be optimized for MT processing, which will also take time and money. The costs associated with switching to IKEASATION are likewise something to consider. If your content already exists in a written format, then you will have to go back to the drawing board, literally, to redesign all of your content. Depending on your organization, this could be a very long and costly endeavor, as you will have to pay content creators to recreate everything with this in mind. For any automation or tooling seeking to replace project management or vendor management, we see similar results. Generally, the costs up front are pretty high, because it takes time and expertise to develop the solution. Once the solution is developed, then the overall costs should drop. In theory, the automation should pay for itself. Clients will perform a detailed ROI, or return on investment, analysis before making any decisions. If the potential savings are more than the costs, then it may make sense for them to substitute. For the LSP, this means that there is always the incentive to provide more value at lower costs, so as to make sure it never becomes a cost-effective strategy for their customers to make that switch. Difficulty and ease of substitution. So far, we have made the point that there is really no full replacement for language as a means of effective communication. If not, then maybe we have been a little too subtle in our opinions. However, there are certainly specific scenarios where it would make a lot of sense to save some budget by substituting. Just with the examples that we have looked at of MT and IKEASATION, it seems that these should be relatively easy to implement. So what, you may ask, are LSBs waiting for? To answer this question, we have to get into a small discussion about how localization is typically managed by LSBs. To put it mildly, many LSBs don't have a single goddamn clue what they are doing when it comes to localization. Some are better than others, and some are downright brilliant, sure, but as a general rule, they are lost. To support this controversial and incendiary claim, we would like to point to the mere existence of the localization department within LSBs. The fact that there is a clear distinction between localization and the rest of the company speaks volumes. Localization is treated as an afterthought, a problem to be solved, and so it is delegated to the lowly localization team so that the real experts in the company can focus on the company's core competencies, whatever those may be. Now, personally, we like localization departments. They have paid us a lot of money over the years. But unfortunately, they are typically completely cut off from the rest of the company and unsupported. Furthermore, in many new companies, the localization department doesn't even exist yet, and the task of translation is just another thing added to the plate of an already busy marketing manager. But we digress. Let's say, for example, that a very experienced and capable LSB localization manager wants to cut localization costs by implementing MT strategy and substituting more instructional graphics for heavy text. She has done her research. She feels that by using illustrations more effectively, total word count can be decreased by 40%. Furthermore, she knows that if the remaining content is formatted in a certain way and written in a certain style, the results from MT would be of acceptable quality. However, currently, all of the content she is being asked to localize is poorly written and completely unstructured, making it unfeasible to implement a cost-saving MT strategy. At this point, this is where our poor localization manager realizes her complete inability to effect organizational change outside of her own department. Her idea could be brilliant and could save the company thousands or even millions of dollars, but she is unable to get the organizational buy-in from key stakeholders within her company to execute. In theory, this substitution would be very easy to implement. However, when our localization manager tries to bring about the necessary change to implement this new strategy, she is faced with an insurmountable internal resistance. Historically speaking, the above example is not only common, it is the norm. Until recently, it has been very rare in this industry for an LSB to have a culture and setup that facilitates and streamlines localization from start to finish. This is because most companies have designed themselves to focus on their home market. Only after they are successful in their home market do they start thinking about localization. But by then, it is too late. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. Recently, we have seen an encouraging number of startups starting from day one with an international strategy and building localization best practices into their entire workflow. Willingness to substitute and influence of the LSP. Buyers are usually more than eager to move forward with a substitute service. Sometimes this motivation is just to save some money. Sometimes it is because they are trying to be innovative. Sometimes it is simply out of ignorance of how language works, and they aren't aware of any of the potential risk of not investing in proper localization. If the LSP is not prepared to have a conversation with these clients and educate them, they could lose a potential opportunity. An LSP, particularly those working in the sales core function, need to have an intimate knowledge of substitute services. If a client asks them about it, they can act as a trusted advisor, lending them their knowledge and expertise, and possibly even steering them away from a decision that would not be good for them in the long term. At the very least, an LSP needs to know about substitute services, because if a client decides to switch, the LSP must have a strategy to fit into these new plans. If a customer decides to use MT, many times there is not much that can be done to change their mind. An unprepared LSP could lose the whole account. A prepared LSP, on the other hand, could consult with the customer and let them know the dangers of using raw MT without any human review. They may still lose the translation business from that client, and revenue will certainly drop. But perhaps they can add value by managing the MT process or providing low-cost machine translation post-editing. By being prepared, an LSP can turn a sure disaster into a possible opportunity. Let's say you are working for an exciting startup that produces a hot new smartphone app. You have had great success in your home market, and now you want to go global. In order to do this, you will need to localize several different types of content. Firstly, you need to localize the app itself. Secondly, you need to localize the online support articles and frequently asked questions. To advertise your app in new markets, you will also need to localize some of your existing marketing content. And lastly, there is legal content, such as the end-user license agreement and terms and conditions. Rather than bundling all of this up and sending it over to an LSP for translation, it would be wise to take a look and see if each of these 4 content types need to have the same level of service applied. Your actual app interface, or UI, of course, needs to be of superb quality, so additional testing will be in order. But if your analytics data shows that your online help only gets a couple dozen visitors a month, you can ask yourself, does my online help content really need to be perfect, or will MT suffice here? Legal content may need to be completely rewritten in each market, depending upon the local regulatory requirements. Your marketing content is going to be your first impression on potential customers, so this needs to be really high quality, and MT could damage your brand image. These are decisions that need to be made by each LSB, so no standard answer to these questions is available. An LSB who takes the time to analyze its content types will identify different quality levels for each, and then assign a process accordingly. Content that doesn't need to be high quality could be machine translated. Since documentation is typically much more content than the actual product, this means that the savings can represent a very large portion of your localization budget. A simple analysis may look something like the chart on page 77. The above analysis helps determine the buyer's willingness to substitute translations for MT. If the required quality level is high for all categories, then their willingness to use MT is very low. However, if there are no quality concerns and they have no budget for localization, their willingness to substitute is very high. Remember that translation is bought per word. If you can be more selective about the amount of content you are localizing, then the number of words you are paying to localize will drop accordingly. Another way to drop word count is with IKEASATION. You don't even need to go to the extreme of IKEA, cutting out all of their words and replacing them with cartoons. If you can simply author content in a way that relies more heavily on graphics to explain concepts, then you reduce your total word count. It is important to note here, though, that this means the graphics need to be simple, without any text, and easily understood. This applies not only to your documentation, but also to your UI. Let's look at a practical example. Let's assume that we want to localize the below user interface into German. An LSP is going to charge us 25 cents per word to localize. You want to calculate how much it will cost to have a screen of UI translated, and you are looking at 2 different ways of formatting your UI, as in the example provided. Side note, the example provided here is a picture of 2 different iPhones, one with a menu listing each menu item written out in English, and another with a menu using pictures for settings and configuration, chat, upload, download, and more options. These 2 screens have the exact same functionality, but one has literally 1,000% more text to translate. The one on the left is going to cost more to be translated and may also lead to more problems from character encoding, text expansion, and God only knows what else. The screen on the right replaces the text with simple, easy-to-understand pictures that don't even need to be touched in order to be ready for most markets, saving 90% of the localization costs. If the LSB decides to implement this strategy, it all but eliminates the need for translation. Does this then mean that the LSP is out of work? Not necessarily. Let's face it, most likely the client did not come up with this idea on their own. They got the idea from somewhere else. This means that they are open to consulting. An LSP that is able to effectively coach their clients on language services best practices will always be in demand. Sure, they may end up coaching themselves out of their old job of providing translations. Still, they are evolving their service offerings to make sure that they still have some influence and continue to add value to the language services value chain, even if it is through completely different services.